I'm very pleased to be part of this group, which this story for me began exactly 1 year ago, when somebody named Julia showed up at FiRe, totally uninvited, and started talking to me with great activity and passion in her voice about this thing that I hadn't learned very much about, but thought I knew all about probably, and knew nothing. And it turned out this is, of course, human trafficking. And Julia, I was unaware. I knew her only through her acting career, but had founded ASSET, which stands for Alliance to Stop Slavery and End Trafficking, and has been spending kilojoules of energy daily running around the world working on this project for quite a while. And if you check it out, it turns out you can Google this and go to YouTube and so forth, and you'll find her work at the California state level, changing the laws for the UN around the world, in New York, on television, talking on every TV show she could find, and basically making a big nuisance of yourself trying to solve the world's problems. So we're really happy to have you here. And I think we should start probably by asking you to do what you do best, which is to introduce this subject in your own way to the audience, who probably, like me, thinks they know something about it and are about to find out they don't know very much.
Thank you, Mark. I want to speak to just that because I really believe that this is an extremely emotional issue, and yet I really believe that the only way to get to the solutions come from innovation and design and engineering. And what I see as I work on this issue is I have a comfort as somebody who tells the human story with the emotional side of it. I'm a complete Luddite. So I want to thank Mark, I want to thank Hugh, all of the people who've worked with me in giving me a space and patience around the technical side of it. And it's interesting to me how one personality from the NGO community then works with people from the tech community, and what can be emotionally overwhelming for them is if we bang on about the tragedy behind the story. So I want to thank you for the smarts of offering us a safe space and sufficient time to work together and really listen and hear the specifics of each other's challenges. I thought before coming, how do I personalize this? How do I bring it back to the human? What we're talking about is harnessing technology to create a simple global rescue system. I have a daughter, and at 3 years old, I asked her, what's our rescue system? What's the plan if you get in trouble? And she said, drink lots of water and go to the front desk, which was indicative of our life at the time of lots of hotels. But whenever I go to a big fair or something, I have a rescue plan. What we need is that for people who are vulnerable, a kid in Bangladesh who's going on a journey, a woman in Eastern Europe who needs to find work somewhere else. We need to give people who leave a certain country, who potentially are poor or illiterate. Here is what you do when you land in a country that you might even not know what country you're in. Here's what you do when you get there. You text this, and it sends a signal here, and we will just come and rescue you. We don't have that to an alarming degree. And that's why we can't get to a massive global prevention campaign. That's why we can't help people. That's why we can't give people agency. That the most surprising people, whether it's an 8-year-old child or a woman against an entire military, were they given that agency, they would use it. So I'm going to kick through some definitions quickly. I describe enslavement as when one person completely controls another, uses violence or violent threat to maintain that control, exploits them economically, paying them effectively nothing. Trafficking in persons is a form of enslaving someone. Now, where is this and what's the scale? Essentially, this is everywhere. So you have people who are either enslaved for generations in a particular village, or you have mass migration of people seeking sustainable livelihood. Language and illiteracy is a huge challenge to us. Our approach is to look for the systemic solution. So while the impact feels evil, I feel that we really have to focus on that. I want to talk of one case. We tend to think of this as an Asian issue. It's child sexploitation in Cambodia. There is huge child sexploitation here. There were Mayan agricultural workers who were in a slave camp in Florida between a Ramada Inn and an old folks' home, who didn't even speak Spanish when they escaped. Their Mayan dialect meant that they turned around and went back to the slave camp rather than being helped. So we need to look for the weakest link in the system in order to solve it. I think I'll shut up now.
Well, I have one question for you before
Yeah.
you go. I know that when I started learning about this, I knew so little that I was unaware of how these things start. And you know, I think I had some kind of preconception about if you're a bad person, bad things happen to you, or only the very poor, or only those, you know. And what I wasn't aware of was the variety and cleverness of ways that are used to entrap people and then ship them around the world. Could you just talk about that briefly?
What I have been seeing more and more clearly is that I think we are seeing in today's world a kind of global epidemic of abuse and response to it. We're seeing people under stress. Poverty is a fantastically stressful circumstances, and as a human being, you go to fight and flight. If you look at 9/11, if you look at Kamikaze, it is fight and flight. People have, as human beings, we react to that under stress. People under stress, all of us as human beings have good and evil. When we're challenged, we make good or poor choices. That's why we have to look at this systemically. We need the scientists' perspective to break it down systemically to get to the solution rather than look for evil.
So somebody, for instance, in Romania who's very poor, there's no hope of whatever, right?
If you're a woman in Russia and your child is ill and you can't get to antibiotics and your child's going to die, you're going to do whatever you can to get money. You are going to take the risk. You know the risk. You don't have a choice. I've sat with a mother in Africa who had 4 children who willingly sold one of her kids into child slavery, knowing the risk to that child in order to feed the other 3. People under poverty are faced with a horrific Sophie's choice. If we had a global rescue system, people who have to take the risk, who end up being victims of this, if they had a way to get out, they would.
And often these risks look like a job.
Yes,
the person
they are
thinks they're going to get a job
presented as
in
a
London
job.
or a job in Paris doing something kind of interesting.
Or there is a coercion aspect of the coyote or the smuggler. They present themselves as a smuggler, somebody who will help somebody from Latin America across into the United States. They'll say, we'll charge you $200, but actually they sell you on the other side into a trafficking ring, into enslavement, and upgraded to the 2,000 or 8,000 or 18,000 that is required.
And another misconception that I had that you quickly disabused me of was that this is pretty much about sex. And in fact, I think that, if I understand you properly, more often than not, that's not the case.
We as an NGO community are not doing a great job. There's all sorts of conflicting definitions, conflicting stats, because trafficking is a different group to the enslaved, which is a different group to the forced labor group, which is a different group to child labor. So the ILO, the International Labor Organization, will talk about 150 million people, say. So the ILO, the International Labor Organization that covers forced labor, will say that for every 1 person forced into the sex trade, 9 people around the world are forced to work. That is agriculture, mining our products, and all the rest of it.
Big. So we know at least that it's not just about the sex trade. This is all about all kinds of enslavement. It could be in factories, it could be in agriculture, it could be in any kind of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
and what we're looking to is a rescue system that will speak to all the different faces and forms of trafficking and enslavement.
So I'm going to come back to you in a minute. This is kind of fun for me because we had this talk, and then some time went by, and then Andrew Wallis, who we're about to jump to, and Julia came up to Friday Harbor where I live. We did this kind of all-nighter thing. We Skyped Australia and managed to loop in our friends from Australia, Hugh, and it really got to be rolling. And I've watched the energy you put into this, and you've really amazed me about it. So Andrew, you're in the UK.
Yep.
You have this group which you've been running for quite a while called Unseen or Unseen UK.
Yep.
Would you tell us about that and what you've learned about the government's attempts to help?
Okay. Unseen, we work directly with survivors of trafficking, and predominantly it is sex trafficking. That's where we started, but we're now looking at kids and forced labor as well, and enforced criminality, and so on and so on. So we take care of people when they've been rescued. We also work with key stakeholders in terms of law enforcement, local government, national government. And our number one goal is actually primarily to put ourselves out of business. I don't want to be, doing this in 20, 30 years' time, because then we failed. I also chair a think tank working group in London looking at the UK perspective in terms of what is happening in terms of slavery in the UK. We abolished slavery 200 years ago, but in the UK we now have more slaves than ever before.
Globally, that's true, actually.
Pardon?
That's globally true.
That's
there are
true as
more
well.
slaves today than ever before in history.
So I'm somewhat uniquely placed in that I both work with survivors, but I also have an overall picture of what's going on in the UK. So I'm in and out of the Home Office and various other government departments ad nauseam. There's just a ton of work to do on this issue. And I think my perspective from the UK, but I think it's true wherever you look in the globe, is that there's no strategic direction or action in terms of combating this problem. What you have is lots of little different tactical responses to immediate needs that you might face. So it's a privilege to be with you because you guys instinctively think strategically. So that excites me, to be able to speak with you guys and just start seeing the creative juices flowing in terms of how do we do things strategically. Politically, in the UK, I was with the Prime Minister at our last anti-slavery day, last October, and he pledged there that he wanted the UK to lead the world in combating trafficking. Great pledge. And politicians are really good at making these grandiose statements, but then when you get to, the rubber hits the road, it's a little bit different. So one of the things that we have in contrast to what you have here in the US, and Mike's going to talk a little bit about Polaris, you have in the US a national hotline in terms of trafficking where people can call in with tips, or people can call in if they're in trouble or if they want more information about the subject. We have one in London. It's open from 9 till 5 and is in English only. And I was talking with the senior police officer Monday to Friday, no weekends, because we don't have slaves at the weekend.
Just for banking slaves.
And a chief police officer in the UK said to me, she said, well, in effect, it's an answer phone service. So if you're in a situation of enslavement and you've got that tiny little window where you want to get out, it's almost like you phone and then it's an option service. If it's sex, press 1. If it's forced labor, press 2. And down through the menu system. But bringing it back to what we're looking at and what we discussed up in Friday Harbour in terms of, I think one of the interesting things, I went back and we asked survivors, did you have access to a cell phone when you were in that enslaved situation? And 70% said yeah. And we know this from when we have teams that go out with vice squads that do sweeps of brothels looking for victims of trafficking. And they came across 2 Chinese women who knew that they'd been trafficked. They knew that they had to pay off a $40,000 debt bondage, and that the way that they were being forced to do that was they'd been shipped to the UK and they were having to prostitute themselves. They were controlled by their mobile phone. So every Monday they would get a text message that said, you will now catch the train from wherever this part of the UK you're in to this part of the UK, and you go to this address, and that's where you're working this week. No interface with their trafficker. They were controlled by that and by the fear of debt bondage. And they said to us, because we said, why don't you come with us? We have a safe house that you can go to right now. You'll be safe. You'll be treated as a survivor. You're not going to be prosecuted by law enforcement. And they said, well, if you're prepared to pay $40,000, then we'll come. And what we did was we somehow managed to get hold of their phones. The police tracked them, and we could just track where they went around the country the whole time. So victims do have access to this sort of technology. But there is this tiny window where a victim of slavery says, I want to get out, or I don't want to be in this situation. They may have been duped into that situation. They may, quote, willingly be in that situation, but there comes a point where they just said they want to get out. And so but we have no global rescue system. We have no means. In the UK, you can phone an answer phone. Whoopie-doo. That's leading the world, apparently. But whatever we need to do, we've got to design something that keeps the victims safe. That's vital, because they are living in fear, not only for their own life, but for their lives of their extended family. And I just want to finish with a quote from a survivor, because I think this keeps it real in terms of what we're dealing with. She said to us, before I came here, this is one of our safe houses, before I came here, I was blind. But now I can see. All of you, thanks for keeping me safe. And that's the personal bit. For me, that's what motivates me, which is keeping them safe and getting them out of that situation. But I want to invite you to come on a journey with us. And I want to invite you to put me out of business.
While your business goes up. We're not looking for everyone to go out of it. I just want to add something to what you said, because I think sometimes when we talk about how trapped, due to the psychological threat to the victim they are, then how does why would that person get out? Frequently, what you find, I've interviewed children who were trapped in Thai fishing, who jumped ship and floated on a barrel for 2 days, in shark-infested waters, because that was their safest option. As they get sick, as they get vulnerable, if they cause trouble, the way that Kevin Bales from Free the Slaves will describe them is as disposable people. On US soil during transatlantic slavery, it cost the equivalent of $40,000 in today's money to buy a young male agricultural worker. Today, you can buy that same young male agricultural worker for $300. When they get down to the point where they feel they are vulnerable, that is when they reach their tipping point of, I need to get out. And that's often the case. Or they're not steeped in it, but there are certain arcs that people go through.
So Mike's with us to talk today. And Mike, you have a police background, I understand, right, from New Jersey. So you actually have you're actually a real guy here in terms of facing this. You've been through this for a long time from that perspective. And you're here also as part of NCMEC, which stands for the
National Center for Missing and Exploited
Children.
Children.
Julia. So welcome. And you guys, as I understand it, kind of a quasi-governmental thing. You have a charter to take care of the problem of missing children and exploited children. And you've got a hotline and all kinds of stuff going on. So give us the U.S. picture of this story, if you would, from that perspective.
Sure. So tomorrow, for those that don't know, is National Missing Children's Day here in the United States. And that was born out of a case from 1979, Eton Papes. And I don't know if anybody's been checking the news today, but somebody else was taken into custody by New York Police Department who has confessed to the abduction of Eton back in 1979. That case was a 6-year-old boy who, on his first trip to school in the morning, without his parents, never came home and has still not come home. A few years after that, Adam Walsh, the son of John Walsh, he was abducted out of a shopping mall down in Florida. And that launched what we call the missing persons or missing children's movement here in the United States. In the early stages, you saw children's pictures, "Have you seen me?" on the milk cartons. In 1984, President Reagan signed into law the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as a private nonprofit organization, but with mandates from Congress on what the services we ought to provide to the United States. And part of that was to be the national clearinghouse for missing children. So back when Etan and Adam were abducted, they were reported to the police departments, but the police departments had no cohesive way to investigate missing children cases. Back then, in 1979, if your 8-track player was stolen out of your car, the police would come, they'd take the report, they'd put it within the NCIC criminal computer system, and if it showed up in another state or another town, you'd have the serial number in this database so that you could track the 8-track tape player. That didn't exist for children. And so one of the first things that happened was legislation where all missing children cases would be entered into this national crime database. We created a hotline that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so we can receive reports of missing children. And everything that we've done over those last 28 years since we were born has been as a result of a tragedy in the United States and a mandate by Congress. So if you go back into the 90s, when the internet started to become real popular with the public, America Online, CompuServe, those types of things, the World Wide Web was born. And now kids were being exploited, lured online, enslaved, trafficked for sex, and there was no response around the country that law enforcement could provide that was consistent. So Congress again asked us to create what's called a cyber tip line. And that's online reporting in which we can receive reports of child sexual exploitation, child prostitution, which in a lot of cases with trafficking and enslavement is part and parcel. And as a result of that, last year, we handled 326,000 cases of reports to us on the cyber tip line for child sex exploitation. There was a study done by the Department of Justice a few years back. They estimate about 797,000 reports of missing children every year in the United States. That's a phenomenal number. And let's put it in a bit of perspective. We don't work 797,000 cases at the center. We maybe handle and assist law enforcement with about 7,000 to 8,000 a year. Those reports are children in a lot of cases, and the vast majority of the cases, who live in dysfunctional homes, settings in which they run away from. And so they go from the frying pan into the fire. When you run away from home, you now have to still feed yourself and you have to find shelter and all these other things. And so Julia mentioned coyotes and the people that prey upon kids. Well, these kids are then brought into the whole issue, drugs and alcohol abuse and then trafficked for sex and child prostitution. Right. So we provide that. 2004, we had the Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans. As a result of that, the New Orleans area was evacuated, and kids got on this bus, and their parents got on that bus, and this bus went to Dallas, but this bus went to Houston, and so another mandate from Congress that we were the National Emergency Child Location Center. As a result of the work during Hurricane Katrina, we reunited over 5,000 kids with their families. Just think what a mess that was. And today we've taken on just recently a sex offender tracking team where we work with the marshals, because we know that unaccounted for sex offenders often are abductors, often create crimes against children or perpetrate crimes against children. And then just this year in January, we started a child sex trafficking team. And what we found is that a lot of our kids that go missing are also being trafficked online. So last year, Craigslist shut down their erotic personal section in response to a lot of pressure from Congress, the attorneys general around the country, and in response to some of the pressure that we put on. It still proliferates out on all these other auction sites, whether it be Facebook is a social networking site, but Backpage is another, the erotic review. There's all these sites where children are being trafficked every day for sex and sex purposes. And since the beginning of the year, we've had 500 kids that are being trafficked, or 500 cases of kids being trafficked online, and a lot of them are those kids that go missing as runaways or...
Okay, thank you. A grim picture.
A grim picture, but we've made a lot of progress.
Working hard on a grim picture.
And a lot of the progress is because of all the
Julie,
technologies.
did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say that internationally, if a child goes missing, they end up here. And at their recent event in DC, they have the most impressive public-private partnership that I've seen in this space. And they showed a picture of a young kid who kicked and fought her way out, having been trained to do that. They honored.
So we agreed as a team before we came here that we wanted you to understand that the problem without depressing everybody in the room so badly that they wouldn't want to touch it. And in fact, spend some time on the positive side of what else can be done. And when Julia came to see me, the question really was simple. Here are all these, a year ago, here are all these technology leaders at FiRe. Is there a technology solution that would be part of the larger solution to solving this problem? And we talked about it for an hour or so. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was the chance that maybe there is a way of making a global rescue system that these guys could do exactly what you described somehow. And after some more conversation, I thought of my good friend Hugh, who was wise or unwise enough to step right up. And so I'm very glad you're here, and I'm very glad you're helping this group. It's a really terrific thing from Telstra. And so we turned to somebody who actually knew what they were doing, because I have no idea. So I thought, well, Hugh would understand the carrier's perspective of the technical side of how to do, is this doable, how would we do it? Are there various gotchas involved and various paths we ought to know about? Would you speak briefly about that?
So I must admit, Mark, when you sent me this thing, I thought, oh, yeah, this is a worthwhile cause, and I'll knock it over in a couple of hours. Right. Then, as I started speaking to Julia and Andrew, I realized that there were a massive set of constraints around the problem. There's a whole list of them. I won't go through them all. But first of all, you want this to be universal, obviously. So you can't assume that someone has a smartphone, a victim has a smartphone. You can't even assume that they've got a data plan. You can probably assume that they most likely have access to a mobile. It's more than likely a feature phone. It's more than likely prepaid. And it doesn't have any allowance for international data like that. It probably doesn't even allow toll-free calls, because in many countries, a toll-free call is charged for on a mobile. So then on top of that, you've got to assume that this person is not in the country in which they received the phone, because they've been trafficked across borders. You've got to assume that the rescue organization is somewhere else. You need to be able to promote a number that's easy to remember and that is universal. And we started looking through solutions. I got my team together, some very smart people, and there are 4 possible things. Of course, you can do toll-free numbers, and you could potentially create a global number. It's extremely hard to do. You could possibly have a global SMS number, equally hard to do. The most promising solution appears to be using a very little used feature on GSM phones called USSD, which is I can't even remember what the acronym means, but it's a signaling system. It uses the signaling network. It's available across every GSM network. It's almost never billed for. But it doesn't work, for example, on Verizon and Sprint and China Telecom. So there are big gaps in this. But I figured we've got to find a way of ratcheting our way up and solving as much of the problem as possible. We're not going to solve it overall.
Now, Hugh, we have 2 slides here that I think you know about. Should we put those up now?
It might just be instructive to put the second slide up, just so that people can see the sort of what the... that's the first slide, and I won't, as I say, go through. We came up with 10 constraints on what makes this a hard problem. If we could have the second slide. That shows the interrelationship between mobile networks. Now, to create a solution, there are roughly 600 mobile carriers in 200 countries around the world. You've got to coordinate all 600 if you want a single number. And finding a single number, for example, there's a universal emergency number on GSM, 112. We want the equivalent of that, 113, but that's going to be very hard to do. It was done initially in the standards. But perhaps with USSD, we could find a number. We could create a place where the messages get relayed to a global organization, and that would at least give the phone number of the victim's phone. And once you've got that, then the authorities in the country in which that person is can start intercepting calls in and out of that phone and start locating traffickers and being able to pin them down.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what we have here basically are the beginning bones of an idea and a technology suggestion road path, which, if it works out, would be the first time we would actually be able to fight back, because almost all these people are very, by the way, the folks who are involved in this are extremely clever. Imagine drug cartels, modern crime syndicates from Russia and from other countries. These are not stupid people, and so we're trying to come up with a system which won't harm those people who are already been victimized. You can't put a little bracelet on them because they'll be harmed by being identified. So it's got to be something that someone who gets involved in this, didn't know they were going to get involved, may just have had the idea at the last minute that they were at some risk, could memorize a number maybe, and then when they show up later in a different country, they may not even speak the language, how do they get out? And so I'm very encouraged by your help, Hugh, and I think we're about at the point where we should do the ask. You want to do the ask?
All right, so we invite all of you to come join our breakout session to hear more. I think that was a spectacular presentation, but I think you just saw exactly what we were talking about in terms of efficiency and summing up. We would like, in order to facilitate the ongoing work that's needed to enable us to get to the GSMA in order to help us pull in carriers of 800,000 for phase 1. If there are 8 people in the room who want to put in 100,000, that would be great, or even one person who can put in 100,000, that will get us started. We also want to thank you, because I think we've also talked about extending this as a project, because there are a myriad different tech solutions that can be brought forward in terms of follow the money and laundered money. I just want to say that providing this solution is what enables the British government to rally round. Governments can't move if there isn't a solution, if they don't have the access or innovation. If they can't see a technological solution, then they can't resource it. If this is designed and delivered, it is a massive catalyst for everything else, the protection, the prevention, the prosecution to follow. This is a massive deliver globally. And what we will do through this partnership is bring in those people who have resources and relationships with China, with Russia, to make this work going forward. So I'm really excited, and I want to just thank all of you for listening. And
can I just add, just before I came, I spoke with our Home Office, the UK Human Trafficking Centre, and the lead police officer, and I just sketched briefly what we were thinking about and what we were going to say here. And they said, if you can pull that off and make that happen, that'll be a huge step change in terms of dealing with trafficking and enslavement.
And we happen to have a bunch of smart guys and women out here who love, there's nothing to love more than an impossible problem. So if you have ideas in hearing this that you think would be helpful, please tell Julia or tell Andrew or Mike, anybody in this group, or me, and we'll get it to the rest of the group. And I imagine you will. So you can also come to the breakout and share your ideas there. Obviously, they need financial support to get this thing rolling, and I think at that point the governments will take over, but something to get this thing started would be very helpful, and particularly your thoughts and ideas about things we haven't thought of yet. I'm sure that there are many.
I just wanted to add one final thing. Moise's name in the book Illicit umbrellas the illicit trade of people as a part of all global illicit trade. That's intellectual property theft, it's the pirate DVD sales, it's illicit trade that is killing and taking a massive toll on industry.
So
solutions in this space create solutions in government relationship and government activity around that as well.
So read this book.
Read that book, Illicit.
Illicit. All right. We're good. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.